Esther. Today, we were in Esther. When Chris announced a couple of months ago what our next sermon series was going to be about picking a character, Esther was the first one that sprung into my mind. And you might say, but what's Esther got to do with the Ragamuffin gospel? Because she's a queen. When you dig back into it, and Esther's a book, I don't know about you, but I've loved Esther. It's one of those books that I read and I love it. I love what it kind of stands for. But actually, when you go back to the beginning of it and you read where Esther comes from, you see that person who is effectively a nobody, but how God uses her. And so we'll explore that a little bit. Now, this is one of those books where you can't do all of it in 20-25 minutes. So if I miss stuff, I apologise, but I hope that what I bring out is what we maybe need to hear at this moment. The other thing is that the reading that Rich has done is one of those phrases that's so well known. It's that who knows that you've been brought here for such a time as this? And the whole story has just, particularly since Friday, has just left me thinking of all the stories of all the people at all the times to choose to preach on when we find ourselves in this place as a church. Whew. So let's see where we get to. I may veer from my notes slightly. And if I'm on my phone, I'm not scrolling Facebook, don't worry. It's just, I was banking on there being a hardback Bible that I can read, and they've all disappeared. So I'm praying that they've all been given to people who need to use a Bible. So my phone is just in case I need to dive back into anything that I haven't got printed out. So Esther. I kind of feel like we need a little bit of a context for this book to understand. Ultimately, the reading has plunged us kind of into the middle of all the action. It feels like quite a doom and destruction kind of book. The Jews have just received an edict that says that on a certain day in a certain month that people are going to go out and they're going to annihilate the Jews, which is quite a scary place to just drop into. But it kind of sets the scene for what we're just going to pull out of Esther's story in the book of Esther. For context, we have previously we've worked our way through the book of Daniel, and we know that Daniel was taken into exile along with others by King Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm not going to say that name again. It's going to be King Neb, if I have to refer to him at all. There's a whole host of names right through the Old Testament that just you don't want to have to keep repeating yourself over. And King Neb is one of them. He has taken the Israelites into Babylon. They have gone into exile. 100 years later is when we see the story of Esther set. So it's some time later. But there is a reference within Mordecai's story that explains that actually they are still part of this remnant that are exiled in this area. So the kind of context is that the Jews are living in these provinces that it's not their own land. They don't have their own king. They're in this foreign place. They're still living effectively in exile, even though by this point they've been allowed to go back home. So some have returned, but Esther, Mordecai, others are still remaining in these provinces. That kind of ties it in with other stuff that we've spoken about in the past, kind of sets it into a context in terms of what's happened in that area. It also, the book is kind of in two halves as well. And then as we come into the first part of the whole book of Esther, you see there's another king. Just why? Oh, he's referred to as King Xerxes, and I'm going to call him King Xerxes, but he does have another name and I can't pronounce it. It's Ahasuerus or something. King X. Can we call him King X? Is that okay? He is a very powerful king. He has great wealth. He's a very proud king. It's described in the first chapter of Esther that he rules over 120, it specifically says 127 provinces. He's got a vast area that he rules over. It's kind of like the whole known land. So actually, when it comes to the edict that the Jews receive, there's nowhere for them to flee to because it's all his land. And at the beginning of Esther, as you come into it, he's having this feast, and this feast lasts about 6 months. You know, he's really wealthy. He's invited so many people into this place. Serious amounts of money, serious amounts of wealth and power, and that people will come. So much wealth and so much power that as the feasting continues, actually, the people that he is hosting, if you like, his servants have been instructed to give them whatever wine they are used to drinking. So it's not just that this is one lot of wine that everybody's given, but it's actually, I'm so rich that ask them what they want to drink and get that for him. So he could have hundreds of different types of wine, not just the one. He has power. He has wealth. But equally, very quickly within the first chapter, you realise that this king, whilst he does have great power and wealth, actually doesn't make a lot of decisions by himself. Whenever there's a decision to be made right throughout the book, I would say to you, if you haven't read Esther, go away and read. It's 10 chapters. If you do it over a week, it's 2 a day. But he always consults people before he makes a decision. So in fact, it's their decisions that he's making. He's going to other people for the decisions that he makes and how he runs things. He doesn't actually, in the whole of the story, make a decision for himself. So whilst he's powerful and wealthy, actually the decisions come from elsewhere. The other characters that we see come in very early on in the book. We have Queen Vashti, who is his queen, who very quickly is not his queen. And in this first part of the book, one of the things in this pride and in this wealth is that actually there's a kind of a showing off that the king's doing here. And one of the things that he really wants to do is show off in his drunkenness, because they've been feasting for some time now, show off his beautiful queen, this Queen Vashti. And she refuses to go into his presence in the feast, which she don't do with King Xerxes. She refuses to go into his presence. She's kind of quite wise in that, I think. We often see Queen Vashti that she disobeys the king, but actually to be taken by a drunk king to show off, to make himself look good in front of all these other drunk people, is actually not a great place to be. And I think she's made quite a wise decision there. But actually from the king's point of view, he has gone, and he is told that she has disobeyed you, and just in further setting the context, that if you let her get away with this, all of the wives are going to see this behaviour and they're going to do the same with their husbands, and they're going to disobey them. And then the whole place is going to go into uproar, because all these women aren't going to be obeying their husbands. We'll not go down that route. But setting the context, he now has no queen. He's embarrassed. He's angry. She is deposed. She doesn't. Nothing else happens to her, but she's deposed and sent away. And he makes this edict that women should not disobey their husbands. It's important to know at this point that as the king, he cannot revoke his edicts. There are other things that he decides further on in the book, and they cannot be revoked. He cannot revoke even his own edict. He has to have a new one to upstage it, if you like. So into this arena, we enter into the story of Esther. There are other characters at play. Her uncle, Mordecai, is described as being a descendant of those who've been taken into exile by King Neb. So he's still in this area. He's living surrounded by the pagans. Esther's parents have died, and he has effectively adopted her and has raised her as his own. And through this first part of the story, I could read the whole book. I'm not going. Don't worry, I'm not going to. But Mordecai plays a part in saving the king's life once already. If I read chapter 2, I'll condense chapter 2. Just to give the background of Mordecai. And it also sets the scene for how they are living as Jews in the surrounding area. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, so that's the main city, whose name was Mordecai, the son of... names. Say it with confidence. That's what you said, isn't it? Say it quickly and with confidence. Son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, who is Esther. It's her Jewish name, Hadassah. We hear her and know her as Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So the next bit refers to what happened. After the king's calmed down, he's deposed Queen Vashti, and he sends out his servants into the whole of the province to gather together all the beautiful virgins from the area, bring them into his harem, and then he's going to choose a new queen. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, who is one of the king's eunuchs. We've heard about eunuchs, where Philip meets a eunuch. Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young women pleased him and won his favour, and the young woman, Esther, pleased him and won his favour. And he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her kindred, her people or kindred, so she'd not made known her identity, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So the next bit in the context is that actually the Jews are still living in this land, but the fact that he is instructing her to hide her identity from the palace suggests that all is not well in that relationship with the Jews living in that land. Otherwise, she'd just come clean and make it known that she was a Jew. So she's kind of in hiding, but in plain sight of the palace. Haman is our next character, who is a man who is too big for his own boots, really. He's full of his own importance. It kind of just goes back to this whole sense that there is in this first part of the book of this pride that people have in who they are. He also, as the story unfolds, takes on a historical hatred that there is between the Amalekites and the Israelites. And so that as the story unfolds, he actually personally takes on the persecution of the Jews in this place. But he's not so powerful, because there is a point where he's been promoted to a royal position, but the people have to be instructed by the king to bow to him. So they don't naturally do that, which says there might be something in Haman's character that actually people don't like, that the king has to tell everybody to bow down to this man, Haman. So, the setting. In the palace, Esther's been taken in. She's hidden her identity. She doesn't really have a choice about this either. And I think when you think about the edict that's been sent out after Queen Vashti has disobeyed the king, for Esther to have said, no, I don't want to do this, would have been a very dangerous place to put her in. When an edict has gone out to say you must obey, she kind of effectively doesn't have much choice. And yes, she's taken into the palace, and yes, she's given, it describes her as being given cosmetics and good food, and she's given a good position. It's kind of a life of luxury. But actually, there's an unwritten thing that's kind of written, because they get taken into the king to spend the night. Wink, 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 wink. But it's effectively sexual slavery for these young women, where the king is going to select out of all of these women which one pleases him the most. This is not a pleasant place to be or situation to find herself. But she hides her identity. To an extent, she complies with what she's being asked to do. Even Mordecai requires her to hide her identity. She's kind of going along with the story at this point. She's doing what's being asked of her without actually standing up for who she is and what she believes in. But then as chapter 4 comes round, which Rich has read out, we're setting the stage for a massive turnaround in the story that's taking place. Mordecai has already saved the king's life, because he's overheard a plot by his bodyguards to kill him, and he reports it and saves the king's life in doing that. And that gets written down in the records. So he's done something good for the king, although it's not actually rewarded at that point. But then he also refuses to bow down to Haman, because the request is that everybody bows down when Haman passes by, and Mordecai refuses this. And this is where Haman's anger starts to burn. And he doesn't just have it in for Haman, but he has it in for the whole of the Jewish people living in the area. To the point where, as you read through the story, he doesn't make his own decisions. He goes to his wife. His wife tells him what to do, which is to build a really tall gallows to hang Mordecai publicly in. You can see that out of somebody's pride, we have this saying, don't we, pride comes before a fall, that actually there's a stage is being set for a very big fall. But then chapter 6 starts, and there's a really simple phrase that's used, and it says, that night the king could not sleep. I don't know about you, but when I can't sleep, I read. Now, the king didn't read. He got somebody else to read for him. Great, wouldn't it? Joel, come and read to me in the night at 3 o'clock in the morning. But as they delve into the records, he realises to his embarrassment that he hasn't honoured Mordecai for saving his life. And he proceeds to then do that. And this is where things go really wrong for Haman. Now, Esther, in this whole chapter of chapter 4, has by this point stepped forward into her identity. As we read through the passage, she obviously hasn't realised this edict that has gone out against her people, because Mordecai has to instruct her servants to explain it to her, effectively probably to read out the edict to her, to explain what is going on out in the provinces, and recognises that this is the point where she has to stand up. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from another place. She has, through her compliance, actually been gradually brought into the heart of the royal household. And she finds herself in this place for such a time as this, where actually she's asked to step into her identity and to speak up for her people. But in doing so, it means she has to potentially sacrifice herself. Now, in all of this story to date, there is one name, one being, person that has not been referenced once. And I wonder, there's not quite a Sunday school answer. If you've heard who's missing so far, God has not been mentioned once. And as you read through the whole book of Esther, actually God is not referenced to in any way, other than she calls her people to fast, which is a religious working out. So obviously there is reference there to fasting. But actually across the whole story, there's 10 chapters here, God is not mentioned or referred to once. He is obvious by his absence. And some of that is reflected in what you see happening in that first section, in those first few chapters. It's in the pride and the power that you see, in that God has been abandoned. He is not there. He is not present. Even in the Jews living in that nation, and even in the instruction to Esther to hide her identity, there is almost like God is not present. But that doesn't mean that God is not active. Now, it's the only book of the Bible that does this, but it's not the only place or the only story. So if you were to go back and read in Genesis, get the right book, the story of Joseph, you'll see similar. You get the story of Joseph, but actually God is not referred to, although you see his hand through the things that happen. But Esther is the only book. So you think, but this is included in what we now have as the Bible to refer to as Christians. It gives a prime example of what happens when God is abandoned, when he is absence. We see injustice, we see that towards the queen and to the women in the area. You see pride, you see selfishness, you see depravity in the way that the women are treated in the palace. It's a do what I want attitude, not what does God want attitude. But then you start to see, as you read through the book, you see, you might want to call them the coincidences, but as the piece is moving to the place, and as people take up courage to stand up for injustice like Esther does, you see how God has set the stage for something to happen. We see his silent sovereignty working through completely ordinary events. Now, we might say that we see that today, don't we? There is actually an echo. We see that working today. Actually, we can recognise how God is working in Esther because we see that happening today. Yes, we do still see miracles and we pray for things to happen, but we know that he also works through ordinary circumstances and ordinary people. Tim Keller has got a sermon series on Esther, and he says, when you see one of the 10 plagues in Egypt, you know it's God. But when King Xerxes gets drunk and starts bragging, you don't say there's God at work, but the book of Esther is trying to tell you, don't make that mistake. God is at work. His silence, I've got this one on a slide. I'm going to repeat this one. His silence is not absence, and his hiddenness is not abandonment. So his silence is not absence, and his hiddenness is not abandonment. God has not abandoned his people. The other question, when you're reading through, particularly when you're reading through the Old Testament, is if the Old Testament is referring to what's to come in what we now read in the New Testament, in the Gospels, is what is happening in this passage that refers to the Gospel. What is happening that is a reference to what is to come. So if the Gospel at its heart is about one person stepping into the gap to bring deliverance, then we see in Esther a foreshadowing of the one who is to step into the gap. In this situation, she might be following the rules that she's been set, but it's brought her into the centre of the royal court. And it kind of echoes, if you think about the story, I've mentioned the story of Joseph, but think back to the story of Joseph. With his coat of many colours. I was listening to that the other day. Like his dreams and the kind of pride that seems to be there. But actually there is an outworking through the pit and through the prison into the court, where he is put in a place for such a time as this, when famine hits the land. He steps into the gap and it brings deliverance to more people. Esther steps into the gap for her people. There's some little phrases that kind of carry across as well. So Jacob, there's a bit in the story of Joseph where during the famine, Jacob has taken his family into Egypt for help. And as they leave, they haven't recognised Joseph, but as they leave, Joseph has got some of the servants to stash some gold, some trinkets into one of the bags, and they find it on the way back home. And he sends 2 of his sons back, not knowing how they'll be received, because he thinks they've potentially stolen it. And he uses the phrase, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved. It's kind of like an accepting of the situation and what needs to work out. And Esther says in this, as she sends her instructions to Mordecai to fast for her, that she will go into the court of the king and she will wait. And she says, if I perish, I perish. She kind of accepts the fact there's an element of self-sacrifice that may be required of her. And when you look ahead and we read through the Gospels and we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's pleading for God to take this from him, and he says, but if it is your will, I will do it. That kind of sense of, this is going to take something of me, but if it's right, and I will do it. There is that echo and that foreshadowing of what is to come, even before we've even got there. Even before we've even got there. as she paves the way for the salvation of the Jews, Christ steps into a world that has abandoned God, puts himself in a place of self-sacrifice, not just for that one moment in time, but for all people. But there's the contrast. Whenever I read this story and I think about how Esther approaches the king, in her finery, she puts on all her makeup, puts on all her glad rags, and just goes and waits in the court, knowing that he might not call her in. That actually, it might enrage him, and she might be put to death because she has tried to approach the king without his permission. And he reaches forward his scepter, and she touches it, and it's that picture of acceptance into his presence. And I love that. I love the contrast that we have as Christians in that sense of when we come before our King, we don't have to have that fear because he's already called us into his presence. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for him to stretch out his scepter to us because he's done that through the death of Jesus on the cross that gives us that acceptance into his presence. Jesus paved the way for our salvation once and for all. God is clearly at work through the book of Esther, through her story. It's just been hidden from plain sight. Now, I've talked about how she kind of complies with everything that's going on and finds herself in that position. I'm not advocating that's how we live our lives, that we just go on with what there is out there, because that's what happens, and God does, he will work things out for his good. But it's not a case of just saying, I'm going to live how I please because God will work it out. Actually, when we read through the letters and when we see how Jesus speaks to the people around him, we realise that there is a way to live our life when we are Christians, when we are called to him, and that we do our best to live like that. But it is about recognising that there are times when that doesn't happen, but that God is not absent. He is still working things out. Esther is also a story about standing up for injustice, isn't it? She walks out completely the verses that are in Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. That's the requirement of all of us as we live out our lives before God. It's to seek justice for those who can't do so themselves. It's to love mercy rather than pursue justice. And it's to walk humbly rather to walk how the king and Haman and all those people in those courts walked, with pride and selfishness. But to walk humbly with your God. To not hide our identities, but to walk with him. And it also, that kind of sense of that, just I found myself singing Waymaker last night when I was thinking through the last bits of this. God's presence and handiwork is all around you, even when you don't see it. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. So we can stand here, and even in today, here we are, today in this place, knowing that this will be our last time here. And we can ask those questions of, was this right? We could say, if only. Esther could say, if only. If only, and hindsight are wonderful things, aren't they? If only. If only the Jews hadn't been taken into captivity. If only Queen Vashti had obeyed her king. If only lockdown hadn't happened. If only this, or if only that. But actually, that's not the place where we should dwell as Christians. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And if any verse were to sum up Esther for me, that verse sums it up. That whatever the Jews have been through, whatever they have faced, God is still working things out for his purpose and for the good of those who love him. And actually the end result, when you get to the end of of the book, what you find is that a new edict has gone out, allowing the Jews to fend for them, to fight for themselves, to fight back. And which they do. They can take up arms and defend themselves, but actually partly in fear, because obviously they all want to get killed in the area, but loads of other people kind of take on the Jewish tradition too. It's like that gospel effect, isn't it? That when you stand up for Christ and when the gospel goes out, that more people come to faith. And in that situation, more people became Jews. There was a growth once they stood up for themselves and said, do you know what? I'm a Jew and I want to stand up for my people. So I can't remember the guy's name. He spoke at one of our prayer days at the Message probably 2 months ago. And he was talking about the Romans 8:28 verse. And he kind of just condensed it into one short phrase. And it's that he wastes nothing, and he gets you ready. For all things, God works all things for the good of those who love him. He wastes nothing, he gets you ready. Nothing that has happened to you is wasted. And whilst we might not see it now, we will see it work out for good. He is getting you ready for his purpose. And that includes today. It includes this week, this last 2 years. Nothing is wasted. He has been working, shifting things, putting things into place, making a way with us, and often, dare I say it, despite us. Despite the fact that he had been effectively forgotten as we read through Esther, he's still working things out, and he's still working in the background. His silence is not absence, and his hiddenness is not abandonment. So I don't know about you, but I stand here today feeling a little bit, that's my word. There's no words, it's just, The question's like, did we make the right decisions? Are we in the right place? What's next? We believe that God led us to this place, to this neighbourhood. What's next? Nothing is wasted. He gets you ready. Where do you think God is being absent or silent? When you look deeper with his perspective, where can you see him actually working? I wrote down here, is there a gap you need to stand in for injustice? That's kind of a question that I'm asking myself as well at the moment. But like Esther, is there a place where we need to stand into a gap for other people? He wastes nothing. He gets you ready. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we see you even in the places where you maybe cannot be seen in plain sight. We know that you are working in the background of all things at all times. Even when we don't see it, you are there. When we don't feel you near, you are working. And as we look through the Old Testament, and we see people who maybe we haven't paid much attention to, but maybe we feel we know their stories. Lord, even in the places where it appears on first sight that you aren't there, you are working in the background and moving and placing things, placing people into positions where they can stand up for you and stand up for their people. We thank you for how we see Jesus through the stories of the Old Testament, how we see that foreshadowing of the gospel. the example that it shows us. That even before he came, he was foretold. And that we can see those echoes like a ripple that go out through history, pointing to him. Of the ways that people have stood in the gap to bring salvation, pointing to Jesus who stands in the gap for all of us. And we thank you for that story becoming real in our lives. And Lord, in the story that is RK, we know that you are there working in the background. And whilst we may not be quite sure what's next, we know that we believe we have followed you here. You are real in our story. And Lord, we just pray that by your Holy Spirit you would guide us and lead us, that your purposes would be worked out amongst this family of believers in this community.